To debate whether to move forward on the Violence Against Women Act. At 2 Eastern, senators are scheduled to discuss going ahead with the resolution disapproving a National Labor Relations Board rule on union elections. Then more debate on the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization. And if 5 senators consider the judicial nomination of Missouri State Judge Brian Wimes to a federal district court in Missouri. A vote on confirmation is expected at 5:30.
The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. O God, who does wondrous things, blessed be your glorious name forever. Remake us in your image and bring our wandering, wayward hearts under your control. Lord, infuse our senators with a love for you that will make their obedience willing and joyful. Astound them with your limitless resources and supply all their needs from your bounty. Keep them humble with the conviction that they can't breathe a breath, think a thought, speak a word, or perform an action without your mercy and grace. Grant our supplications, we pray, in your sacred name. Amen.
Please join me now in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., April 23, 2012. To the Senate. On the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Carl Levin, a senator from the state of Michigan, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Majority Leader's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. America has the best, brightest, and most dedicated workers in the world. All those workers need is a fair shot to succeed. But right now, many workers in this country don't enjoy the same rights as the wealthy CEOs. That is a right to negotiate the terms of their employment. A new rule from the National Labor Relations Board will remove unnecessary obstacles to workers' rights to form a union. I solidly support this rule, and I urge all my colleagues to vote tomorrow against the resolution of disapproval that would strike down this common sense rule. The new rule doesn't change or do anything to encourage unions, but it doesn't discourage them either. It just gives workers the ability to vote yes or no while minimizing the chances of intimidation and stalling. Mr. President, tomorrow the Senate will also vote on a number of amendments to a bipartisan postal reform bill. This important piece of legislation will safeguard more than 8 million jobs of people that depend on a vibrant postal system. It will also protect postal customers, particularly elderly and disabled Americans and people who live in rural parts of this country. I'm pleased we reached an agreement to allow senators to offer amendments to this bill. And I hope once we work through the amendments tomorrow, we'll see a strong bipartisan vote to modernize the Postal Service and save this important institution from insolvency. Mr. President, this institution is so important, it's contained in our Constitution. But once we pass postal reform tomorrow, as I expect we will, the Senate will move on to consideration of another very important piece of legislation, Reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Since its passage in 1994, this piece of legislation reduced the annual incidence of domestic violence by more than 50%. Despite that incredible progress, we still have work to do to keep women and their families safe. Mr. President, 3 women die in this country every day at the hands of abusive partners. Weekends, holidays, no days off. And for every victim who's killed, there are 9 more who narrowly escape death, in effect are beaten savagely. It would be unacceptable to step back from our national commitment to stop violence and abuse now. This legislation was the brainchild of Vice President Joe Biden when he was a member of the Senate. It does a number of very important things, such as allow communities to get some support in setting up shelters for these women and their families to go in secret. The law was unanimously reauthorized by the Senate in 2000 and 2005. This effort should be, and traditionally has been, above partisanship. I hope that proves to be the case again this year. And this year it has 60 co-sponsors and the support of 47 state attorneys general. I can't imagine why my Republican colleagues would oppose such a worthy piece of legislation. I'm hopeful, Mr. President, I'm somewhat confident they won't. By joining Democrats to pass this legislation, Republicans can help us send a clear message that this country does not tolerate domestic violence. If the Senate doesn't complete work on this critical legislation before we recess for the work period, we'll continue after we come back to try to work through any problems that I see. But I really don't see any at this stage, Mr. President. But the Violence Against Women Act isn't the only pressing matter the Senate has to complete next work period. We must begin work on a number of appropriation bills. We must consider additional judicial nominations, take up legislation to cut taxes for small businesses, that expand and hire. We have cybersecurity legislation, which I've been told that the House is going to take up soon, and I appreciate that very, very much. We must also address a looming crisis for millions of students in America. The July 1st deadline for interest rates to double on federal student loans is fast approaching. With middle-class families struggling and fewer families able to afford the rising cost of higher education, we cannot afford to put college out of the reach for promising young people. Doubling interest rates from 3.4% to 6.8%, effectively socking 7.4 million students with a $1,000 a year in student loan increase, would do irreparable harm to our ability to educate young men and women. Today, Americans have more student loan debt than credit card debt. So why would we, Mr. President, want to double what they pay? The average graduate owes $25,000 when they graduate. Getting a college education shouldn't burden young people with unsustainable debt. Unfortunately, some Republican colleagues have signaled they would rather cut taxes for the richest of the rich than invest in the next generation of American workers. But the business community agrees making college affordable is key to keeping America competitive in a global economy. An investment in education is an investment in our economy. So I hope we'll all join together, hear the message, and work together to stop 8 million students in this country from having an increase in the amount of money that they are obligated to pay back for the loans they get to get an education in America today.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of the motion to proceed to Senate Bill number 1925, which the clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 312, S-1925, a bill to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act of 1994.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
I thank the Chair. Mr. President, as has just been announced by the clerk, the Senate is now considering the motion to proceed to S-1925, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act. At 2 p.m. This afternoon, the Republican leader or his designee will move to proceed to S.J. Res. 36, a resolution of disapproval regarding the NLRB election rule. The time until 4 p.m. will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees. At 5 p.m., the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the nomination of Brian Wimes to be a U.S. District Judge in Missouri, and there will be a roll call vote on confirmation of the Wimes nomination at 5:30 p.m. Mr. President, as you know and our colleagues know, after a lot of work and good faith negotiations, we reached a bipartisan agreement last week to complete action on the bipartisan postal reform bill tomorrow, with an agreement that includes almost 40 amendments, 39 I believe is the number, to be voted on tomorrow. Although we, and really particularly our staffs, have been working with sponsors of the amendments, and we expect that probably more than half of them will be negotiated to agreements, modified, and or accepted. But there still will be a significant number of roll call votes which will begin tomorrow afternoon after the respective party caucuses. Though there was a good amount of debate on the postal bill last week, tomorrow, once we go from S.J. Res. 36, the resolution on the NLRB election rule, to the postal bill in the afternoon to begin voting on the amendment, there won't be much time for debate. And as announced last Thursday, after this agreement was achieved, as is evident to those who are in the chamber, Senator Collins and I are here, and we'll be here both from now until 2 p.m. when we go to the NLRB rule. We'll be here from 4 to 5, which is the next open block before we go to the judicial nomination, and we're prepared to stay this evening after the judicial nomination as long as proponents or discussants of the various amendments want to come to the floor to engage in debate and discussion on them. And I hope our colleagues will do that. As Senator Reid said, this is an important piece of legislation. Nobody denies that the U.S. Postal Service, really an iconic American institution, which millions of people depend on not just for the mail but for their jobs because of all, both directly working for the Postal Service and indirectly, but not too indirectly, because they work for related businesses that depend on the mail. We simply can't turn aside, do nothing, and let the Postal Service continue a fiscal spiral downward. The Postal Service, as we said over and over again last week, lost $13 billion in the last 2 years. It's going to run out of its, it's going to go over its debt limit later this year. The Postmaster has been very clear that if we don't give him some authority to find a new business model, to economize, that he'll have to take very, very aggressive action, potentially closing, on one list he put out, 3,700 post offices, approximately 250 mail processing facilities, which would be extremely disruptive, both to the post office and to the life of the personal and commercial life of our country. This bill that Senator Collins and I, along with Senator Carper and Senator Scott Brown, offered to our colleagues, offers a sensible but tough way forward to preserve the U.S. Postal Service, but to acknowledge that it's got to change to stay alive forever, but certainly through the 21st century, because of the impact of email that has taken and dropped the volume of mail in the last 5 years by more than 20%. When you lose that kind of revenue, you've got to find ways to economize, and you've got to find a different kind of business model, including different ways to raise revenue, all of which is authorized in this bill. I know some people think our bill doesn't do enough. They're ready to basically close down a lot of the Postal Service as we know it. Some people think our bill does too much. We naturally think we've struck a sweet spot or a point of common ground. In fact, the Postal Service has told us that they believe that if our bill is enacted, that it would save somewhere, after it's fully implemented over the next 2 to 3 years, save somewhere between $15 and $20 billion a year. To be conservative, probably closer to $15 billion, but it's a significant amount of money as the postal, and it creates a series of incentives to alter the business model of the post office, including authorizing the post office to get into some businesses it's not been in before as a way to take advantage of its unique assets and raise more money. So this is a moment of truth for the Senate. Can we, and in some sense it's a somewhat smaller version of the larger moment of truth. We're going to have to face something time about our federal budget overall, but here's a great American institution that is in real fiscal trouble. And we have the ability with this legislation to get it back on a path of balance, stability, and even growth. Some post offices will be changed under this bill, mail processing facilities. Some of them will be closed, though less than the postmaster has said he wants to have happen. We have authorized a significant amount of money to be spent to incentivize 100,000 postal employees to retire. They're eligible for retirement with an incentive. We think they will, and that itself would save the Postal Service approximately $8 billion a year. This is not one of those bills that people enjoy voting on, but it's our responsibility. It's just necessary that we face the crisis that the Postal Service is in and help it stay alive and flourish throughout the century. So that's what's on the line in the bill. The amendments cover a range of topics. This was a very broad bipartisan agreement on the amendments. There's some that make the bill tougher, some make it softer. They all deserve a good debate. And that's what Senator Collins and I are here to do now. Before we get to that, Mr. President, may I say that I understand that S-2327 is at the desk and due for a second reading.
Clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S-2327, a bill to prohibit direct foreign assistance to the government of Egypt and so forth and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with respect to the bill.
The objection is heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar.
I thank the chair and yield to my distinguished ranking member, Senator Collins.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President. Mr. President, we're going to resume debate today on the postal reform legislation that our committee, on which the presiding officer serves, has worked very hard to produce, and to do so in a bipartisan way. As Chairman Lieberman has indicated, last week we labored very hard to produce a list of amendments that will allow members to work their will on this legislation. There are many different viewpoints on the path forward for the Postal Service. But, Mr. President, there can be no doubt about one fact. The Postal Service has lost more than $13 billion in the last 2 years, despite being relieved from a payment that is required under law towards the health benefits of future retirees. It still lost billions of dollars. And if we fail to act, if we turn down this bill, the Postal Service will not survive as we know it today. And that is a fact. The Postal Service later this year will have great difficulty even meeting its payroll if we do not act. The Postal Service will max out on its credit that it can borrow from the Treasury if we do not act. The Postal Service will be forced to resort to dramatic and draconian service cuts that will drive still more customers from the system if we do not act. So, Mr. President, just closing our eyes and pretending that somehow the Postal Service will find a way through this without our legislation is not a realistic option. As I've indicated, there are a variety of views on both sides of the aisle on what the appropriate path forward should be. And we will have a vigorous debate today, we started it last week, on what the best option is for the Postal Service. For me, the bottom line is this. The Postal Service will not survive if it pursues a course that risks alienating the remaining customers that it does have. So resorting to widespread closures of postal processing plants, which would essentially do away with overnight delivery of mail, raising prices so that big mailers pursue alternatives to using the Postal Service for delivery. Those are not the solutions to the Postal Service's woes. On the other hand, the Postal Service clearly cannot continue to do business as usual. It has to innovate. It has to look for new sources of revenue, and we've given some very specific ideas in our bill by allowing, for example, the Postal Service to provide services and share space with federal, state, and local governments, and to also ship beer and wine with a signature from the customer, just as its competitors, FedEx and the UPS, United Postal Service, are able to do. We also do not prohibit the closure of all post offices, nor do we mandate that a certain number be closed. Instead, we set standards. We set service standards. And those service standards would govern the decisions that the Postal Service would make. And I think that is the appropriate way to approach the very difficult issue of how to reduce the infrastructure of the Postal Service. But the fact remains, Mr. President, and it's a painful fact, that 80% of the Postal Service's budget is workforce related. And it is always difficult to recognize when a workforce, particularly one as dedicated as the American Postal Service workforce, is simply too big for the volume of work that the Postal Service now has. But there are compassionate ways to deal with this workforce problem. And what our bill does is it allows for a refund of an $11 billion overpayment that the Postal Service has made to the Federal Employees Retirement System, known as the FERS system. And this is an overpayment that has been verified by an independent board of private actuaries that the Office of Personnel Management relies upon. It has also been verified by the Government Accountability Office. So this overpayment, in part, can be used and would be directed to be used by the Postmaster General to offer retirement incentives and buyouts up to and capped at $25,000, the exact same number that is used in buyouts in federal agencies, to reduce the workforce. Now, more than a third of the Postal Service's employees are eligible for retirement today. That is why the Postmaster General believes that if he provides a bit of an incentive, he can reduce the size of the Postal Service workforce by more than 100,000 workers. That's about 18% of the entire workforce. And that approach of using retirement incentives, buyouts, incentives like that is very similar to the approach that the private sector uses, that large corporations use when they are faced with the painful task of having to downsize their workforce. The rest of the overpayment refund would be used to pay down debt, something that the Postal Service desperately needs to do as it approaches that $15 billion line of credit cap. I want to stress, Mr. President, because there's going to be a lot of discussion about this, perhaps very shortly, that these are not tax dollars that are being refunded to the Postal Service. I read from a letter from the Inspector General on the floor last week that verifies that the revenues for the FERS payment come from two sources. They come from the postal employees themselves who contribute to the FERS system. And the revenues come from the Postal Service's own revenues, which are from selling stamps, mailing packages, and the other services that the Postal Service provides. So this is not a taxpayer bailout. It is not a refund of taxpayer dollars. This is a refund of a substantial overpayment that never should have occurred. And that's a whole nother issue of how it occurred, of money that the Postal Service's employees and that the Postal Service itself, from revenues that it generated, contributed to the FERS system. An overpayment that has been confirmed by the GAO and by an independent board of actuaries hired by the Office of Personnel Management. That is a very important part of this bill. If the Postmaster General is successful, as I believe he will be if he aggressively implements these provisions, in compassionately reducing the size of the workforce, the estimates are that that provision alone would save about $8 billion a year. And it would allow the Postmaster General to right-size many of the processing plants. Some of the processing plants are too big for the volume that they now have. But the answer is not to close them altogether, because that has such a detrimental impact on the delivery of mail. That leaves rural America behind. That would result in there no longer being overnight delivery for first-class mail. I'll give you an example from my state, where the Postmaster General has unwisely proposed to close one of only two processing plants that we have in a state as large as the state of Maine. He would keep the one in the southernmost tip of the state, but close the one in Hamden, Maine, which serves northern, central, and eastern and parts of western Maine. Really serves about two-thirds of the geography of the state. If that postal processing plant were to close, mail from northern Maine being sent from one community in northern Maine to another would have to undergo a more than 600-mile round trip to the one remaining processing plant in Maine. I can't imagine how many days that would take. But I am certain that it would cause people to stop using the mails, and thus revenue would decline still further, because there would be no possibility of overnight delivery of bill payments, for example, or bill delivery. This is not the answer. So what is the answer? That plant could be downsized, not closed. We need to preserve the service. But if the plant's too large now for the volume of mail that goes through the plant, why doesn't the Postal Service rent out part of the plant? I'm sure that a mailer in the area, perhaps several mailers in the area, would welcome the opportunity to rent space in that building and be right next to the postal processing plant. That would work very well. There's so many options, but the Postmaster General, in my view, has not pursued those options. When it comes to rural post offices, there are so many options. For example, a post office could be open in a rural community, say from 7 to 9 in the morning and 5 to 7 at night, so that individuals going to and from work could stop and do their business, but the Postmaster General would be able, the Postal Service would still be able to save funds by not having the post office open the entire day. A small post office could be co-located in a retail facility, the local pharmacy perhaps, or the local grocery store. There are possibilities that need to be explored and which our bill directs the Postmaster General to explore in order to avoid the widespread closure of post offices in rural America that will have a detrimental impact on the individuals and the businesses located there. Our bill, in essence, forces more creativity on the Postal Service by, again, setting standards with the Postal Regulatory Commission, which is the regulator in this case, and then assuring that the actions of the Postal Service with regard to infrastructure meet those standards. This bill has many, many other provisions which we discussed at length last week, so I'm not going to repeat them now. But let me just reiterate the point that I made at the beginning of my remarks. We have been able to negotiate with the cooperation of both the majority leader and the Republican leader, and with a lot of hard work by the members of the committee and the floor staff and our staff, a very fair process that will allow many amendments to be offered expressing a wide variety of philosophies and views on the proper road ahead. But what we cannot do, Mr. President, is to fail to act. If we do not act, that will be a death sentence for the Postal Service, an American institution enshrined in our Constitution that is the linchpin of a $1 trillion mailing industry that employs 8.7 million Americans. So, Mr. President, this debate is not just about rural post offices, important though they are. It is about our economy and not delivering a death blow to an institution that is the center of much of our economy. And I hope members keep that in mind as they come to the floor with proposals, for example, to essentially privatize the Postal Service or to do away with most of its infrastructure. Because if those amendments prevail, they will deliver a crushing blow to our economy at a time when we can least afford it. They will jeopardize that trillion-dollar mailing industry that includes everything from paper manufacturers to magazine publishers to newspapers to financial services, all of these industries that are so dependent on the U.S. Postal Service. And that is an outcome that we must avoid. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Republican leader.
Mr. President, I ask consent that my remarks appear at the opening of today's session.
Without objection.
Over the past several months, President Obama has kept a pretty busy schedule of campaign events. But as the President heads out for more campaign-style events this week, let's not forget what he's actually doing here in Washington is far more important than what he's saying out on the campaign trail. Because when the speeches are over and all the chairs and posters are put away, great challenges remain. Millions of Americans are still looking for work. The federal debt continues to cast a shadow over the American dream. And despite assurances made last year, there's no budget in sight from the Democratic-controlled Senate. And as the Associated Press reports just today, about half of college graduates can't even find a decent job in this country. Now, I understand why the President wouldn't want to talk about these things, but that doesn't change the fact that he should. And it doesn't change the fact that his policies are the problem. The American people elected this President to change direction, not to change the subject. They elected the President to change direction, not change the subject. Yet day after day, week after week, as our nation's challenges deepen and another economic crisis draws nearer, this President wants to change the topic. He wants people to focus either on something else or to overlook the things he's actually doing to make the situation worse. Let's take, for example, gas prices. Gas prices have more than doubled under this President. Yet rather than doing something about it, he blames it on speculators and energy companies. Instead of increasing domestic production, he's focused on a plan to tax American energy manufacturers, a plan that would increase the cost of energy rather than lower the cost of gas. The national debt has skyrocketed more than $5 trillion under this President. Yet rather than actually doing something about it, he pretends we should erase it, that we could somehow erase it by just whacking millionaires. Look, millions are looking for work. Yet rather than doing something about it, he passes a health care bill that would impose massive new costs. He continues to threaten new taxes. And he empowers federal bureaucrats to cook up new rules and regulations that make it even harder for businesses to grow and to hire. Unless Congress acts, one such rule goes into effect next week. Most people haven't heard about it because the President hadn't been talking about it. But I'm happy to. because it says all you need to know about this president's approach to jobs and the economy. As a favor to big labor, the president is right now rushing a plan that would restrict an employer's ability to educate workers about unionization efforts, as well as increase their legal bills and the already high cost of complying with federal regulations. And get this, the administration hasn't even provided an analysis of the cost involved in moving forward with this proposal. So tomorrow, senators led by Senator Enzi will have an opportunity to vote on this effort to make it even harder to do business in this country. We'll have a chance to stand up against what the president is doing to the economy. And in the process, we'll be reminding people to focus on what the president does rather than what he says. Look, at a time when America's corporate income tax is now the highest in the world, we should be looking for ways to make it easier for businesses to hire, not harder. At a time when unemployment is above 13% for young people between the ages of 20 and 24 in this country, we should be finding ways to make it more likely they can find work, not harder. But this is the Obama economy. This is the president's approach. This is the painful legacy of his failed economic policies. The president may not want to discuss it, but Republicans will. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Yes, the absent of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
In addition to our live coverage of the Senate, in about 15 minutes from now on our companion network C-SPAN, we'll have a live interview with former Vice President Dick Cheney.
Quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor to discuss S. 1789, the 21st Century Postal Service Act, and I regret to say there's a fundamental problem with this bill that we have to address, and I wish it weren't so, but I'm afraid it is. The bill would increase federal deficit by $34 billion. This violates the deficit neutrality provisions for spending that we adopted as part of the Budget Control Act of last summer, just last summer. As a result, there are at least 5 budget points of order that lie against the bill, and I, ranking Republican on the Budget Committee, will be raising points of order at the appropriate time. That means that it would take 60 votes in the United States Senate, 60 of our 100 members, to say we don't want to agree and follow the law that we passed last summer, that we promised the American people would make a difference, and we'll just spend this money anyway because we think it has an important need. Under the Senate rules, no committee can bring a bill to the floor that spends even 1 penny more than already is going to be spent under the current law, or increase the deficit more than it would increase under current law. Current law is the Budget Control Act of last summer, and it was passed, as we all recall, as part of a major debate over the debt ceiling, the raising of the debt ceiling, so we continue to borrow money. Borrowing at the rate of about 40 cents of every dollar we spend is borrowed. We knew that had to end, so some decisions were made and spending was constrained, although I would contend not nearly enough. In other words, the spending and debt under the postal bill violates the debt limit agreement reached just last summer. In August, we agreed to modest, though insufficient, savings. And in fact, the discretionary spending under that bill is not even cut. Last August, we talked about big cuts, but the reduction in growth is what occurred, and spending this year would increase $7 billion over the spending of last year. And now the Senate is already spending more than we agreed to at that time. This is particularly odd since the President and the Senate Majority Leader have accused the House members, the Republican House, of breaking the budget agreement by trying to save a little more money than the Budget Control Act said that they should save. And this argument is not sound, of course. The debt deal established basic spending caps, basic limits, the maximum amount that could be spent on discretionary accounts. And not one word in that law prevents us or any member of Congress from doing the duty to try to save more money. Not one word in that law requires the Congress to max out and spend up to that cap, to that limit. So this is not a matter of interpretation. Caps are the maximum, not the minimum that we can spend. But this bill does violate that legislation. It spends above the agreed-upon limits. So only in Washington does spending below a cap get you accused of breaking a deal, while spending more than the agreement explicitly states means people just look the other way. The Majority Leader and the Chairman of the Budget Committee are proud of the Budget Control Act. They say it has ironclad restraints on spending. They say we don't even need a budget, which is clearly not accurate. But the Budget Control Act did have certain spending limitations on us. And they've been proud of those. And they said those are sufficient to put us on a sound course. And we're going to follow those, they've implicitly said, I suppose. But where are they when it comes to making sure that this agreement they so proudly talked about is actually followed? It's curious that we don't have a leadership from the Majority Leader, the Budget Committee Chairman, to tell the committee, look, we understand the Postal Service has serious problems. We understand that. Something probably needs to be done to fix that and improve that situation. It may even cost some money, and we may need to come up with some money. But to do so, shouldn't we comply with the law of the United States and what we agreed to just last summer? So as this unfolds, you will hear some say that part of the reason that the spending increases are in the bill is because the bill requires the Treasury to repay the Postal Service $11 billion that the Postal Service has in the past overpaid to the U.S. Treasury, in effect, for retirement contributions of current employees. So I'm not debating that argument and whether or not it's an overpayment. I'm not debating that. We've got experts that have looked at it and said it basically is accurate, that the United States Treasury does owe the Postal Service $11 billion. And under some circumstances, maybe we are required to pay that back. I don't argue that at this point. What I would say is, if we pay it back, is it not an expenditure of the United States? If you're behind on your car payment and you have to make that payment, well, you have to make the payment. But don't you have to get the money from somewhere? And if you and your family have agreed that you're not going to borrow but so much new money, shouldn't you look to see where you can cut spending to pay for that? That's all we're talking about here. Certainly owing a debt doesn't mean you don't have to pay the debt. But as a matter of scoring, a matter of integrity in accounting, you have to understand that it costs money. The money comes from somewhere. Most people understand, I think, that the United States government borrows money through T-bill sales, and we pay interest on the money we are borrowing, and the fastest growing item in our budget is interest on our debt. So we ought to be cutting spending to pay for this if we need to pay for it. Over 10 years, that's $11 billion. Well, that's a lot, but $11 billion is a little over $1 billion a year. And this year alone, we'll spend, as I recall, approximately $3,700 billion. So we couldn't pay this money back. We couldn't find $1 billion a year. To pay the money back, we have to just borrow it in addition to the money we've agreed to borrow, the debt limit we've agreed not to breach. I have to note, unfortunately, the $11 billion is only one-third of the debt impact of the legislation. It is only one-third of the amount by which the bill breaks the agreement of last summer. So what else accounts for the total of $34 billion? Most of the deficit increase from the bill, about two-thirds, would occur because the bill would reduce the amount that the Postal Service is supposed to pay to the Office of Personnel Management to fund the future retiree health benefits under the current Postal Service employees, or for them, coverage for when they retire. And the Postal Service is famous for having good health care and good retirement programs, and what they're legally entitled to somehow should be funded, if at all possible, if there's money to fund it. In 2006, Congress enacted the Postal Accountability Act to set the Postal Service on a self-sustaining course. According to one of the managers of the bill, that law included, quote, a requirement that the Postal Service endorsed at the time, close quote, and a requirement that the Postal Service agreed to, that they would pre-fund the future retiree health benefits of the current postal employees on an accrual basis. And that 2006 law set out a schedule of those required payments to the government. Now, 6 years later, the Postal Service does not want to make those required payments, or says they are unable to. We already enacted a bill last year partially relieving the Postal Service of some of their required 2011 payment. So this bill would defer those payments and stretch out the amount of time to pay them. How much is the Postal Service allowed to defer? $23 billion almost 23 more billion dollars. The legislation allows the Postal Service to defer $23 billion in payments for retiree health benefits. Since the decision apparently that's been made and included in this legislation is that the users of the Postal Service, the stamp buyers, shouldn't be required to pay this money. The idea is the taxpayers will pay the money. So the taxpayers will pay it. Just pick it up. You know, it's a tough thing. There's not enough money going into the health care fund. Yeah, we promised that Postal would stand on its own, but we don't have enough money. So we're not so serious about paying this $34 total billion that we would actually find the money to pay for it. We're just going to add it to the amount that we're borrowing each year. And this year, for the fourth consecutive year, we will borrow about $1,300 billion while we're spending $3,700 billion. It's an unsustainable path. So this means that the Treasury has to go out and borrow the money over the next 10 years because the Postal Service is relieved from making the health care payments. Again, a budget produced under regular order that I have truly felt we should have done and remain disappointed deeply that has not occurred, should have planned for this and would have planned for this, hopefully, by including policy changes somewhere else in the government that would have offset the deficit and the debt increase caused by this bill. And because the bill doesn't do that, because it adds to the debt of the United States, violates the pay-go requirements and the Budget Control Act, I will raise a point of order, and it will require the vote of 60 senators to waive it. If this new spending is necessary, and I suspect some of it may be, then isn't it worth cutting spending somewhere else in this massive government to pay for it? Do we really have to break our spending agreement before the ink is dry on it? The first real bill on the floor of the Senate after the Budget Control Act agreement of last summer violates substantially the spending limitations of that act. So this is at a time when we're facing the fourth straight deficit in excess of $1 trillion, the four largest deficits in the history of the American Republic. Washington is in a state of financial chaos. We are in denial. We are not recognizing, owning up to the fact that there are limits on what we can do. You tell me how long we can borrow $1 trillion a year, how long we can spend substantially more than we take in and borrow the difference, adding to the interest payment of the government every year. The Government Services Administration is throwing lavish parties in Las Vegas. The Government Accountability Office has identified $400 billion. $400 billion. Maybe we could pay the $34 billion out of this $400 billion being spent every year, each year on waste, inefficiency, and duplication. That's the official Government Accountability Office. Far worse, the Senate's Democratic majority has failed to produce a budget plan in calendar years 2010, 11, and now 12. The fact this Sunday, in fact, marks exactly 3 years since the last time the Senate has passed a budget. A budget means responsible behavior. It means that we know there are many places we'd like to spend money. A lot of places we'd like to spend money. But since we know our money is limited, we adopt budgets, or we're supposed to adopt a budget. There's an absolute legal requirement that we do. It just doesn't require Congress to go to jail if they violate it. So it requires and forces Congress to make tough choices. Now we say the Postal Service needs more money, and we won't stay within our budget limits. We'll just borrow it and give it to them, knowing that this is not a responsible behavior. But hey, we don't need to make tough choices, do we? Because the Senate can't say no, and because the President refuses to exercise managerial discipline, we are set to spend another $34 billion in borrowed money. So the White House warns that Republicans want to cut too much spending. But the American people know the truth, and the truth is that we have never spent more money than we're spending today, and spend it more recklessly and with less accountability than we have been spending the taxpayers' money. So this is in many ways a decisive moment. This is not a mere formality, my budget point of order. It's not just something I'm going through the motions of. I believe it's a crucial vote. Now, I respect so deeply my colleagues who've worked on this legislation. It is very complex. It is very important. It is a very difficult issue. This country has got to confront rationally the difficulties in the Postal Service. The world is changing. Emails and other things are occurring. I won't say this is a horse and buggy whip manufacturing system, but it has to alter to keep up with the times, and we can't just throw money at it. And by throwing money at it, often you keep it from reacting to the realities of the situations they're in. So I respect deeply the people who worked on this. But I do believe it's a crucial vote. Even if one supports every dollar of spending in the bill, colleagues, do you support a violation of the Budget Control Act in such a dramatic fashion so soon after it was adopted? Vote to sustain the budget point of order. That's what I ask my colleagues to do. Let's stand up for fiscal responsibility. In effect, it would send the bill back to our good committee, and it would say to them, look at it. If you can spend less, please do so. But if you feel you have to spend money on this postal fix, find out where it should be paid for, propose how it should be paid for. And that would meet the requirements we made to each other just last summer. It would meet the requirements that we and the promises we made to the American people. We said, okay, we're not raising the debt limit until you agree to spending cuts. And there was a total of $2.1 trillion in spending cuts. And we agreed that we wouldn't increase the debt limit more than the amount approved in that legislation. We wouldn't increase the debt over that amount. We would honor the pay-go rule. And that was part of that legislation. That's what we promised each other and the American people. We don't need to violate that now. And remember, a vote to sustain the point of order would not kill the postal reform bill, but a vote to waive the point of order and just spend the money would be a vote to ignore spending requirements and would, I believe, kill our professed commitment to fiscal responsibility. So, Mr. President, I thank the Chair for the opportunity to share these remarks. I hate to see that we have as much as $34 billion problem here. It's going to be difficult to fix it, but certainly not impossible. I would hope that if this bill was sent back, I know my colleagues would figure out a way to pay for it. I thank the chair and yield the floor.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of quorum, but I will be responding.
Clerk will call the roll.